Hello, this is Father Daniel Greeson. I am the director of the Department of Education with the Diocese of the Midwest, and we are doing a series of Lenten videos, basically discussions with various clergymen, but also laity about various, I would say, Lenten themes. And today we have with us Father John Jones. He is Professor Emeritus from the Philosophy Department at Marquette University, and he is a parish priest of a mission west of Milwaukee around Lake Geneva, right, Father,
Yes.
at Holy
Hmm.
Theophany.
Yeah.
And we are delighted to have him with us today because we're going to be discussing a book that I'll say recently. I know I've had this on my shelf for the past few years, but published by St. Vladimir's Press. I'm going to hold it up so that people who are watching on when we upload this to YouTube can see. It is called Moved by Compassion, Exploring the Core of Orthodox Christian Life. And I think one of the great themes of the Lenten season is, of course, transformation in Jesus Christ, that we see especially in the transformation of the heart and openness towards others and moving towards them not just with our hearts but in practicality and solidarity in this is kind of the core of the tradition of almsgiving in the church and one of the, if you want to call the three legs of the stool of the ascetical life in the Orthodox Church of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, then I see the topic of compassion being very key to our Lenten journey. Now, this book, Moved by Compassion, I found it to be moving in its own way. It is written, I'll say, a little bit beyond if you're used to reading ancient faith publications, which are a little bit more general. This book is a little bit more for educated laity. Not that it's not approachable. It's just a little bit written. Look, you're a philosophy professor, right, Father? So
Yeah.
when you come to something, you are not picking it apart, but you are analyzing it. And I love how you would take, and it's very easy to follow you. It's not hard to follow you, but you are thorough in your examination. But before we get to the content of the book, I wanted to ask what inspired you to write this particular book? Because as you note in the beginning of the book, you could not find any, at least contemporary resources that talk about the idea or the reality, the virtue of compassion in the Orthodox tradition.
Well, thank you. Really, the what started me on this goes back into my childhood. Okay. Uh, and I grew up in the 50s in Los Angeles, in Hollywood first, and then out in Bellflower. And one of the things that I had to deal with as a little kid was I happened to be overweight, and in second grade I had glasses that were like Coke bottle bottoms, and I would say picked on by my fellow students all the time. It's what we would call, in a
Mm,
sense, stigmatization. It's extremely painful.
yeah.
And while it was extremely painful, uh, I also became aware of when you read the New Testament, and again, I'm putting back into something when I was in second grade, but I think what I recognized in the New Testament, Christ lives with all of those people in his society that were denigrated, right?
Yeah.
The people on the street. And if you read the way that, especially in Luke, it's very clear that he was identifying with these people, and it was clear, at least for what I couldn't articulate, he loved them, and he was being compassionate towards them. And I always loved the parable of the Good Samaritan. And if you'll notice on the book, there's the icon of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And one of the things I finally realized when I was doing the book was something St. Theophylact said when he said the parable of the Good Samaritan was, yeah, it's about Christ telling a parable about himself. And Theophylact says, well, he didn't remain on his own. He didn't just walk by us. He came and lived with us, helped us, and saved it. And I think the core of the book that I did was ultimately the parable of the Good Samaritan is a parable about Christ himself, and it is a parable of the entire incarnation from the moment he takes flesh. And when you look at the icon where he's carrying the injured man on his shoulders, and especially the icon where you can see the injured man being beaten by the devils, and then you see Christ carrying us as sinners, like I tell my parishioners very often, Jesus is still the Good Samaritan in every Eucharist, because when we receive the Eucharist, he's still carrying us on his shoulder. He gives himself to us out of compassion. I mean, look how many times we use the word compassion and mercy in our liturgy, over and over and over again. The Father, through the Son, and the Holy Spirit give us the body and blood of Christ is a gift of compassion. And as I tell my parishioners, if that's what we get through the liturgy, then the question is always, what do we do after the liturgy? What does our liturgy after the liturgy look like? And I'm sorry, I can't remember the author that comes from. I said, well, the liturgy after the liturgy is you go out into the world and love others as Christ loves you, which means you try to be the Good Samaritan to all of your brothers and sisters. And in particular, that means you never, ever denigrate anyone at all. And that's why I spent a lot of time in the first part of the book distinguishing between compassion and pity, because pity for us simply means feeling sorry for others, and it's very easy that people can pity others who denigrate them as well. You can't do that with compassion. So that's why there was so much that I spent in the first time of the book. Frankly, I'm to a point where even when pity is used in some of our translations, I don't use it anymore. I switch it to mercy and compassion. Because one of the things I learned when I was teaching this at Marquette, I would say 10 or 15 years ago when we're talking about this with students, and a lot of them were Roman Catholics because of Marquette, a lot of them weren't. And I asked if they thought pity and compassion were the same thing, and they shook their heads, because for them, pity simply meant feeling sorry for putting somebody down. Compassion didn't. So I think in our English language, pity and compassion don't mean the same thing. Pity can lead people to doing things, putting them down, simply feeling sorry for them, that is fundamentally different from what compassion will ever allow you to do. So, and I try to explain that to my parishioners, and the example is very practical. Go and live like Christ lived, love others like Christ loves you, which is really the central of Christ's ministry to us, right? And some of the things that, St. Maximus the Confessors and others say, the closer you draw near to God through compassion, what does it do? It turns you back into the world to love your neighbor. Okay?
Right.
And as I tell my parishioners, the paradigm example of that is the Theotokos, right? We venerate her because she is the first human being ever to be deified. And what's the first and oldest hymn that we sing to the Theotokos? Make me behold your compassion. Deliver your compassion to me. So the Theotokos, to me, reflects the compassion of Christ, and it's why it's so central to our faith. And one of the reasons I tried focusing on it is because it became very clear to me, especially when I read people like John Chrysostom, Gregory of Nyssa, Gray the theologian. Compassion was central to who they were as human beings. Later you found it with John of Kronstadt, St. Maria Skopstova, even though she doesn't use the word very much. You look through those men and women, and compassion was central to their lives, and it was an output of their love for God himself, following the first commandment. Right. So I would say that's the later thing, but over my childhood, I spent a lot of time moving towards that, because I was so aware when I grew up. Now, I've discovered when I talk to people who never got put down, they don't understand the dynamics of being stigmatized, okay? Because they've never had to go through that. Fortunately, in some way, I had to go through that, but I looked around, and when I grew up, the racism in Southern California was just terrible. But it wasn't just whites against black. There was racism between Hispanics and black people. The attitudes towards women were just brutal at that time. And the attitudes towards people who had issues with mental health, the denigration of parts of our population at that time were just awful. And fortunately in the 60s we began to move through a lot of that. I'm sorry, I'm going to be very blunt. Unfortunately, we're moving back into those attitudes right now. And it fundamentally violates what Christ told us to do. So I become very, it was that awareness of people being denigrated, and how Christ is a good Samaritan. At the core of his compassion was he always recognized them as his brothers and sisters in the fullness of their humanity, no matter who they were. So that's why compassion to me is so important. It's not just this feeling of doing something nice. It's grounded in this attitude within us, like mercifulness is, where we open our hearts to everybody, all of our fellow humans, but like a number of the other saints, we also open it to the whole of creation, right? We're made to be ministers to creation, which means we never turn things into just use objects for me. So it took a long time. Albert Schweitzer was one of the most famous people that really influenced me when I was growing up, because he came from my religious tradition. When you read the things that he did after he led to be a scholar on Bach and moved to Africa, the stuff he did back then was just extraordinary. And there were a
You
lot
want,
of other people
Father,
that
do you
did.
want to explain who I know who Albert Schweitzer is, but can you explain a little bit who Albert Schweitzer is?
Well, he was a very famous organist, and he was also a scholar on Bach. In fact, when I was studying piano, of Schweitzer's books on Bach, but eventually, I forget what it was that triggered him, but he moved off into Africa and basically, I mean, lived a life of compassion. He took care of the natives who lived there, and he also was very sensitive to the world around him. He wouldn't walk on grass, he'd walk on the concrete. He was open to this sense of this solidarity with the whole of creation around him. I know that's a contemporary word, but it works. This solidarity with the whole of the world around there, and
Right.
taking care of them because he loved them. Okay. Unfortunately, later it turns out he did bring some of the Western European attitudes towards natives in Africa that I think marred somewhat if he did. But he still managed in a way that many people didn't during his generation to express his love of compassion. Maria Skopstova is a contemporary example. Okay, a
Yeah.
lot of our
Yeah.
saints are, right.
Yeah.
The film about Saint Luke the surgeon, he did the same thing. Okay.
That I think what I found very enlightening in reading, especially as you're parsing through, and maybe you can uh, riff on this a little bit of just because you mentioned a little bit is the difference between compassion, mercy, and pity. Because I think you're right that a lot of us there's some of us have an intuition that we know that there's a difference between
Yeah.
them, but we don't always know. And so I think that's part of the reason why you see in translations we think pity and we think, oh, that's basically equivalent to mercy or compassion. But I think you make a very good case that for English ears, English speaking Anglophone people, when we hear these words, if we pay attention to the words that we're using, which I think is another important thing for us, uh, is paying attention to the words that we're using and having some clarity of thought so that we know not only what to think, but also what to do with our hearts and how to act. But if you could, just for a little bit, expand on what you think the difference exactly is between compassion, mercy, and pity.
Well, part of the reason the book seems so philosophical is because when you look back in the history of English language, there's no agreement about what those terms mean, right? And if you look at the varying way terms like iktermos are translated, some people use pity, some people use mercy, some people use compassion, but none of the other translators tell you how they understand the terms, right? They simply use one term as another. And it's the same way when I was looking at issues of compassion well outside the Orthodox tradition. The definitions of compassion and mercy and pity, they're all over the map. So part of the reason I spent so much time in the first part with the conceptual analysis is I wanted to try to develop a meaning of compassion that I thought was integral to our tradition. And part of the reason I distinguished it from pity is because while a lot of the older English translations, for example, even the New King James that Diocese uses pity. We even use the word pity in the Divine Liturgy at the end of the prayer at the end of the first antiphon, right? And while that may have worked a few decades ago, today it doesn't, because I think I mentioned to you before we started. I had a class at Marquette, and I used to talk to my students about this. And I'd say about 10 years ago when I was teaching it, I asked them if they thought pity and compassion were the same thing. And they shook their heads. They said, pity's just feeling sorry for people. That's not what compassion is. And that made it clear to me that if we're going to use our English language to make the scriptures and our liturgy clear to us, we have to use the terminology in the way we understand it. And that's led me to think we really would do best by getting pity out of our language, because we don't pray to God to ask Him to feel sorry for us, right? But that's what the word pity connotes to a lot of people in our younger generation. So that's part of Professor dealing with the younger generation that motivated a lot of the books. So pity ends up just feeling sorry for people, but it can also be very egoistic, right?
Right.
And part of the egoism, and this goes back to stuff between Hobbes and one of the later Christian thinkers, and again, you'll just have to forgive my memory, but he pointed out when these guys talked about pity, it was just me standing there and looking down on people and feeling sorry for them. And this guy flipped between compassion and pity, and this later, it's in the book, but this later 19th century theologian said, no, that's not right. Pity is what this guy says, is just feeling sorry. But compassion means you live with the other person and for the other person. So this fundamental difference between pity and compassion in our language goes back to the 19th century. It's not simply a modern introduction, although we tend to blur it a lot. And I really think it's to our advantage to keep these things straight in the way we use these terms. The difference between mercy and compassion, I think when I did the book, compassion always leads you, it's moved by compassion, which is what the verb is. Some of the translations are you have compassion, you feel compassion, but the Greek, phlegizomai, means you're moved by compassion. It moves you out of yourself. And when I looked at the Gospels about the parables of Jesus with compassion, like the parable of the prodigal son, or the parable of the Good Samaritan, or just the way Jesus interacted, every time it says he's moved by compassion, it's clear it moves him out of himself to be with others for their own sake, not just for his own sake. Mercy, it seemed to me, was very close to that, but it never had quite that sense of moving. It had the sense of something remaining in the heart. Interestingly, I just did a small article for a little journal, but it came in a class that I designated. And we have prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Well, I've never liked the translation of almsgiving for eleemosynē. And when I did this paper, which was something I didn't book in the book, if you look at eleemosynē, it's basically mercifulness. And rather than being an action, mercifulness is like being compassionate. It's a disposition within the heart, right? But mercifulness is something that leads us out of ourselves to acts of mercies, right? So you can say, eleos within me, or iktros within me, in the singular, this mercifulness within me, but then the plural are all of these things that I do as a response to it. So I think there are a lot closer connections between mercy and compassion for me than I might have done when I did the book to begin with. Because I think because I never had the idea of mercifulness, because you don't find it in any of the translations that's ever used at all. But I think that's really what the three spiritual virtues of Lent are: prayer, fasting, and mercifulness. I think if we got rid of almsgiving, because we tend to think of it as just doing something for other people, but if we look at it as its inner disposition, like being compassionate, it's how we are within ourselves, where we love other people for their own sake, which is how Christ uses mercy.
Right. I have found challenging as a parish priest trying to catechize or teach regarding almsgiving, because there's always all of the practical questions, because inevitably, especially if you're reading quotes about almsgiving, you're having to read late Roman Empire or
Yeah.
Byzantine period, where there are beggars on the street in a distinct way, and there's a culture of care that Christianity especially brought, that
Mm-hmm.
in this day and age there's all sorts of questions attached to that. So what I would love to hear you speak a little bit more, since you're helping me also to understand how better to situate almsgiving especially in the Lenten season, and associating with mercifulness or compassion.
Well, this is what I did at the beginning of this little article. This is a prayer by John Chrysostom about eleemosynê, or mercifulness. Christ says, if you would be perfect, sell all that you have and give to the poor and come and follow me, from Matthew. That may be well part of perfection, but alms or mercifulness may be done not only by money, but by other actions. For example, you may kindly stand by a person to help and defend him, reach out to him with a helping hand. The service rendered by such acts often is done more good than money. Let us set to work all the different kinds of almsgiving. For example, if you're a physician, give your skill. Okay? And like I tell some, because we've got, younger adults who are, like a lot of people, like we were in our 20s, we don't have the money to do these things. And like I tell them, there are any number of ways in which you can show your mercifulness to others, your care for others because you love them for your own sake. It may or may not involve money. You can have solidarity with them. You can comfort them if they're suffering. You can take them places that they need some help. And you get the same thing in the Latin tradition with Aquinas. There's also spiritual forms of mercifulness, right? So if people don't have the money to give alms to other people, which is the way we normally think of, which is the rich people doing these things for those who are poor, then if we look at it in the broad sense of being compassionate or merciful to others, we don't have to limit it to money. Any of the ways we can help other people for their own sake. And in the 20th century, we have to fit that into our own life, our own means, and what we can do. And there are plenty of ways we can fast from that without giving money, right?
Uh,
So
I think
don't,
that's incredibly helpful because, and this I think gets part at the core of what you are advocating for. I won't just say arguing because that makes it seem like you are, being argumentative when we say arguing, but you are advocating for and encouraging compassion as an actual going out of ourself towards the other in such a way that we are sacrificially giving ourselves for the other person.
that's right. And you give to yourself to the other person as your neighbor. And remember when Christ tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, he doesn't answer that guy's question who his neighbor is. He tells this parable of the Good Samaritan to teach him what a neighbor is.
Right,
And Christ is the Good Samaritan. And to be a neighbor in the Greek means you draw near, right? Well, I can draw near to you. I mean, on the computer, you and I are drawing near, but it doesn't mean I care for you. The meaning of drawing near in mercy and compassion is that I draw to you as someone who I care for my own sake. I bond with you as my fellow human being. That is the basis of anything I do in terms of any other assistance. In the same way, if I walk the rest of creation, I don't bond with it just as a use object, although, like every other living being, we have to make use objects out of things. But my core respect of creation, it was given to me by God to love for its own sake and to
right,
modify how I use things as use objects. So the fundamental meaning of neighborliness, which is at the bottom of almsgiving, is, or mercifulness, we recognize and make it clear to our fellow human beings that they are our brothers and sisters, our fellow human beings, and we respect them for, to use a modern terms, their dignity, right? But
right.
that's the same term you find with with Gregory the theologian. There's a parallel term to it. And I think sometimes if the people whom we interact with can experience that, that's far more important to those people sometimes than giving them things. Because, I've had people tell me that, I thank you for giving me money, but the fact that you showed your respect for me, that was more important to me. I can tell you a little story. When I taught at Marquette, it was an evening class many years ago, and we were using John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, which is a wonderful book that talks about denigration between whites and whites. It wasn't cross-racial. And there's a Franciscan parish near Marquette, and I forgive my brain and my memory, I can't remember it, but they had a wonderful meal program for the people who lived on the streets in that area. And this was a summer night class, and that we were at that parish for a while. And I asked the Franciscans, I said, would you mind if my students from this class at Marquette come down and go through the line with the people asking, because I want them to try to understand what it is to live in the world as people living on the streets and what's involved in going through a meal program. And I had a feeling what the kids were going to discuss because I used to see it when I ran meal programs from the other side. But when we came back and talked about it, a number of the students who were middle class, a lot of them Catholics coming from the suburbs, they said, my family and I work down there all the time. And I said, well, what did you discover when you were on the other side of the table? I discovered how wide the table was, that I discovered that the people who gave me the food, they didn't care about me. It was just this act of pity. They were sort of looking down on me. Why do you have to be on the street right now? Why are you coming and getting food? That was an attitude that wasn't even verbally communicated to people.
Yeah.
But it was communicated, and the students on that side of the table saw how painful it was, and I think that affected how they did things. I think it's the same thing in prison ministry. I think we try to do that with our prison ministry. The men and women we act with in prisons, we always affirm their dignity as humans and beings. They're our brothers and sisters. Doesn't mean we don't try to correct them or help them, but we always have the same solidarity Christ as a Good Samaritan had with what was likely that Jewish person across the road.
Yeah.
Okay?
I think that you're pointing to something that I think unfortunately has dominated my Lenten experience in regards to almsgiving, kind of going back to that, but I think is key to what you're making a point of difference. And this isn't to denigrate the efforts to try to like raise money for various causes. But I remember not in the OCA, but I'll just another jurisdiction they would have, and I think the Roman Catholics do this often, right? They'll have like you are going to put money in a little box during the
Mm-hmm.
like a Lenten drive or pledge, and that is fine. But what is, or, writing a check or giving money towards a cause because money is necessary for operations or food lines or all of these kind of things to
Mm-hmm.
operate. But what is essential that is missing in that is exactly what you're pointing at is the heart.
Yeah.
It is treating the entire act of almsgiving as a mechanistic thing that you do, but you're not actually encountering the face of Christ in the other person and being with them and actually able then to be merciful or compassionate to them, as opposed to just kind of like, this is being dramatic, but like just kind of throwing money at the problem, right?
Well, yeah, like see, another example that I used to use in teaching, I was trying to show the differences to students between pity and compassion. Suppose I've been in for this job interview and I really, really want this job, but this is company and they stress being sympathetic and taking care of other people, and yeah, I don't know about that. But then I go down on the street and I'm walking there and there's this old woman standing there and she's got a cane, and I'm standing there, and suddenly I find one of my supervisors, one of the people I interviewed, is coming out of the studio. So I run over, and I get all wrapped up, and I help walk this person across the street who was blind, who was a blind person once said, don't assume you need to walk me across the street, all right? But walks him across the street with the idea, oh, this interview person's going to think I care for people. But it's done out of selfishness, right? And this is another quote from Chrysostom. It's this little article. He says, we're to resemble God in showing mercy and compassion. When therefore we do not have this quality, we are devoid of all good. Christ did not say you shall be like unto your Father if you fast, not if you're virgins, for none of these things can be applied to God, nor are they his acts. But what? Be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. This is the work of God. If therefore you do not have this, what do you have? And if you have the mercifulness, you're going to go out and love your neighbors as Christ loved you. But if you just do the actions, the almsgiving, without the interdisposition, Chrysostom and any of the patristic fathers would have said, that's just egoistic. It's like Jesus said to the public, remember the Pharisees, when they were having the dinner, and, he says afterwards, we say, well, give her the things you have, but basically the Greek, and it's mistranslated, Theophylact's, it's not give her the things you have, but from within yourself, give to the world around you. So if
Right.
you read that parable about where he says it's the Pharisees, he's not saying, well, just take what you have and give it to other people, redemptive almsgiving. Basically what he's saying to the Pharisees, until you get your act cleaned up within your heart, what you're doing is just selfish.
And that's the key for the Lenten journey is prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. I call those the three like legs of the stool. But if you are thinking of almsgiving in this mercifulness or compassion element, then you can also see how prayer is necessary
Hmm.
to prepare the heart and condition the heart and ready the heart to acts of mercy.
Yeah.
But also fasting, I think, is intimately tied into this too,
Sure.
because
Yeah.
the practice of fasting disconnects our own ego from the world in a very practical manner in what we're consuming, right? So I
Yeah.
always explain to catechumens, those who are new to the faith, but not just those who are new to the faith, all of us, even myself, to remind myself, why am I fasting? It's not a diet. It's not just a simple denial, but it's actually a reorienting my entire way of encountering the world, where I can actually appreciate the world for what it is.
Yeah.
Because my experience of fasting has often, outside of the lightness and the freedom, hopefully, of my mind and my heart for prayer, but also that I'm not just mindlessly consuming the world and just treating everything outside of myself as just
Yeah.
a thing.
Well, if we translate it, we shifted away from prayer, fasting, and almsgiving to prayer, fasting, and mercifulness. You see what that would communicate? Just as the prayer is within ourselves that leads it out, and just as the fasting is not this external thing, but it comes from within us to discipline ourselves. If we think of mercifulness as the third alternative, we have to develop this position of mercifulness from which our mercy flows. Right?
Right.
Almsgiving can sever that. Unfortunately, the way if you read the Fathers, not that that's not what they mean by it, but I think that term in English doesn't help us. Right?
Yeah. No, I think you're right, especially because of the practices. Again, it's not to cast aspersion on the practices that have grown up around and trying to
Yeah.
honor the Lenten season, especially for youth, because there's always that like, how do we find something to show them that this is a part of our faith? So, but I think you're right. If we were thinking of it, especially as a movement of the heart, which requires something out of us. And it requires, I think, a sense of, not a sense of repentance, because I think one of the themes that you hit on that comes from pity is that very often I think that we think that we're being compassionate, but we're actually being, we're showing pity because
Yeah.
most of us, unless we're very hardened, react to and respond to need and want and brokenness that's around us. But I think there was, I forget the section, it might have been where you're talking about Jean-Paul Sartre on the vulnerability that comes with
Exactly.
compassion
Yep.
because it's hard to be with different, right? Different people, things where we're not comfortable. Because if you're actually going to those situations, and it doesn't have to be even quote unquote extreme situations of like joining a food line, which I don't think that's an extreme situation, but for some people that can be an extreme situation. But there is something that happens when we are trying to be merciful that is this place of vulnerability. And I think this is probably why very often we close up or we clam up or we harden. So I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to that because I thought that was very enlightening.
No, that in fact was the core of one of the things that I did in the book. And what I learned when I taught at Marquette, because a lot of the street people would walk by on Marquette, and I often noticed that everybody would walk around them or walk on the other side of the street. And I talked to the students sometimes, why are you doing that? And I said, look, if you think that these people are going to rob you, I mean, give it up. That's just fiction. Maybe you have to stay away from these people because at the bottom what has overcome them is something that could overcome you. Let's face it, guys, you're undergraduates, okay? There's no guarantee in our economy that something might happen and you might end up on the streets too. Maybe the reason you can't be with these people, or I'd see it in meal programs, nobody would go over and really have interactions with people there as their brothers. And that's hard to do because people in those programs have been denigrated so often they're very suspicious about it. But a lot of times people wouldn't do that. They'd say on the other side of the table because they're afraid that that could befall them. So what you're saying about the vulnerability is, yeah. And I think one of the remarkable things that struck me about, when the Satan tempts Jesus. I mean, I have no reason to think that Satan didn't know that Jesus was the Son of God. And I think when he tempts them, you know, get the angels to give you some food, jump off a cliff and dominate the world and sell me to yourself. What he was trying to do was to get Jesus in his humanity not to fully accept the vulnerability of his humanity. Don't make you sick. Don't put yourself in danger. Use your divinity to get you out of these things. And I think the
Get out of the
reason,
cross. Don't go the way of the cross,
and
right?
that's the example that I've used. I told my parishioners, if Jesus had given into those compassions, do you think he would have ever gone forward and allowed himself to be crucified? Because even though in his divinity he could have exempted from himself at any moment. Remember when he's in the Garden of Eden when he's being captured and he says to the Jewish people, I've got all these angels, right? That's it. I'm not going to use my divinity to get me out of this. When does he use his divinity to protect his humanity? After he died and he raises from the dead. That's when he uses his divinity to raise his body from the dead. But during his life, he fully accepts the vulnerability that goes along with being a human being, and he associates with the men and women who are ultimately vulnerable, not only because they're poor, but because they're denigrated and written off as human beings. Gregor the theologian lambasts the people in his city who treated the lepers that way, right? There's a very profound concern of that in the patristic period. So the solidarity with people is a contemporary term, but they are first of all our brothers and sisters. That has to be the basis for how we care for them, right? If we don't, we may do good things, but it may suggest that there's an underlying fear that we have. I can remember somebody I knew once, he couldn't stand to be around somebody in a wheelchair. He shoved him aside, but then I finally realized he was afraid, terrified that he might become crippled and end up in a wheelchair, and he was at an age where he told me I'd rather commit suicide than deal with something like that. But see, that's a fear. All of us have got fears like that, right? Some things
Yeah.
we can't possibly deal doing, and if we can't, then the people who have those things, we push them aside because they remind us of the fears within ourselves. And I think the
Yeah.
remarkable thing about Christ, even though he's fully divine, he accepts the fullness of his humanity, the fullness of the vulnerability, also the reality of being denigrated because he was denigrated and humiliated throughout his entire life. He never pushed back from that. He always showed his solidarity, his communion with the people around him who suffered from that. That, I think, is at the core of what I would call mercifulness rather than almsgiving.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially as we're coming up on this Sunday as the Feast of the Cross, the midpoint of Lent,
Hmm.
that at the core of our Lenten journey, because what is prayer, fasting, and mercifulness, if we're going to use a better way to try to get at the heart of what the tradition is trying to tell us about that, instead of the word almsgiving, is the cross, right? It
Hmm.
is our own, because I try to articulate this too to my parishioners, is all of those little spots of fear and where we're afraid of death, and not just like the end death, but all of these little places where we
Hmm.
have to abandon ourselves to God's providence and God's care are crosses for us. And this can be from the small things of, as you just shared about the person who struggled with being able to be compassionate or
Yeah.
attentive to people with handicap. I think that's at the core of so much of the fear, discrimination, rejection, violence of a lot of situations is because
Yeah,
somebody's just different from us. We don't understand the language. They don't look like us. They don't sound like us. They
yeah.
don't act like us. And therefore,
They're
whether we
not
know it
us.
or not, because this is always a subconscious kind of level
Yeah,
of like, but if you're really brutally honest, it's because you're afraid, because there's something there
yeah.
that you think you might be the one who is going to get hurt. So instead, you lash out and get ahead of it and decide that you're justified in that.
Well, and you're right with that. When I lived in LA, there was a famous housing ordinance. It was Proposition 14, and it was going to break down people sort of deciding how they were going to rent units. It was really meant to break down the racial separation in Los Angeles. And I remember there was this petition against it. And I love my family, but even when I heard reasons for them supporting it, it was very clear underneath it, although, I mean, we work with people who are Mexican, we like them. The last thing in the world was they didn't want a neighborhood filled with people living next to them. And I'm not blaming my family. I grew up with that too. I had that stuff, like I tell a lot of people today, being getting over racism doesn't mean you never have negative attitudes towards those. But it's like the saints say about the temptations. You see this stuff wiggling around it, and you tell it, just get out of here, leave me alone. So, we can free ourselves from those things. Doesn't mean we get rid of all of them. We may be fortunate enough to do that, but it means when they're floating around in our mind, we look at them and we recognize we're being tempted to sin against them because what they appeal to is, like you said, we're afraid of the things that they represent and we fall into it. I wanted to mention this is Battle Hymn. This is from a site, my mind, again, my memory. Yeah, grant victory to Orthodox Christians over their adversaries. Okay, and this is a website that says the devil. But then I remember also reminding people, when we do confession, or even when you go up to take communion, at the beginning of the prayer, you quote St. Paul, I confess myself as the chief among sinners.
Right.
So I said, who's your worst adversary? I'm my worst adversary, right? So if we sing that hymn when we venerate the cross, grant victory to Orthodox Christians over the adversaries, Lord, would you please grant victory to myself over myself? That's the first battle I have to resolve. Don't blame
Yep.
it on your adversaries as external to you. And that's what the process of repentance is. But
Yes.
like I tell people, you never ever humiliate yourself. You never degrade yourself. You always accept that you are an icon of Christ, that Christ loves you for who you are as a human being, and no matter how much you may humble yourself before Christ, you always respect the dignity of your humanity as Christ always does for you. You never ever degrade yourself. Because if you do that, then you're basically almost pitying yourself rather than being compassionate to yourself. And there's
Right.
nothing that prevents us from doing that, largely not only to save ourselves, but when we can be compassionate to ourselves and accept our limitations and our vulnerabilities, that's what often allows us to be compassionate towards others. Right?
Right.
So, yeah, I fully agree with what you're saying.
Yeah. What do you think? Because you are articulating, because the beyond just the first few chapters, you explore our tradition, the Orthodox tradition, in regards to compassion, and to start off that kind of content, I just wonder how you would articulate, and maybe it's through sharing what you found in the hymns or some of, as you've already been sharing from like St. John Chrysostom or St. Gregor the Theologian, what do you think is distinct about Christian compassion as opposed to just compassion? Is there something distinct there, or is it just the way that Christians go about practicing mercifulness?
I don't think so. Just one thing, we've got bad wind out, and I'm noticing my lamp is beginning to flicker on and off. So I'm hoping the computer Murphy's demons don't invade my computer and shut us off.
Yes. It's
No,
it's also very windy here.
yeah,
Yeah.
no. My feeling is the compassion that we are to activate as Christians is what pertains to us as humans by nature, right?
Right.
Christianity fulfills who we are by nature what it adds to it isn't something estranged from it. It's rather what it adds to it, if we're Christians, is that Christ manifested himself to us as the incarnate Son of God. It gave Christians, back in the Old Testament, being created, you're made in the image and likeness of God. Jewish peoples had no way of visualizing that because God for them was utterly unrepresentable. We have the wonderful option with Christ. Yeah, I'm made in the image of God. And who is the paradigm of my image? It's Christ. So that when we look at our icons of Christ and see Christ the human, that gold is the divine, his unapproachable light shining through him. So to be compassionate as a Christian means I realize I'm doing what God always wanted me to do as a human being, but now he's given me the primary example to do. I model myself after Christ. And now if I am compassionate as a Christian, I do it with the fullness of the understanding that I'm doing that out of my love for Christ, not because I love Christ and my neighbors are a use object, but like St. Maximus says, the more I draw near to loving Christ, because Christ is love and compassion, the more he's going to turn me back into the world to be compassionate to others. But there are any number of human beings in other traditions that are not Christians that do that. There's a famous book that I read with this. Again, I don't remember the name, but she was studying what she called altruism in the Second World War. But what she meant by it was compassion. And she was looking at a number of people who fought against the Nazis and protected Jewish and Christian people. And she discovered that a lot of them, what she was called, were primarily altruistic, were compassionate. Ultimately, the people who were probably more compassionate were the people who weren't believers than believers. Now, who knows what's going on with Christianity at that time in Germany in the Second World War? Okay, I'm not even going to get into that.
Well,
But
there's
it
a
was
lot
very,
there.
but it was very clear from that book and her empirical study, what she called altruism and compassion has got nothing to do with a monopoly of us as Christians, right? Except for us, we believe we fulfill it because now we see the paradigm, because we do it to be in the likeness of God, which means we do it to be the visible icons of Christ. And like I try to tell my parishioners over and over again, the icons on the wall are a second icon. We're the living icons, right? The icons are representatives of us. We need to see ourselves as living icons in terms of which we venerate, worship Christ. And how do we venerate our icons or our God-bearing fathers and mothers? Well, if you want to venerate and become an icon of Christ living, that's what you want to do. You want to try to be a God-bearing person. And if you're a God-bearing person, not only do you love Christ, God with all your heart and mind, you love your neighbor as Christ loves you, right? It's not that complicated, really.
No, no. But we're the ones who complicate these
Yeah.
things. We come up, this is, I love one of the best explanations I've ever heard of, um, I won't say this as like a historical idea of Phariseeism, but a way in which we can kind of act in a Pharisaical manner is we have a commandment and then we come up with reasonable explanations as to why we can't fulfill the commandment in the way that we know that we're maybe convicted of, but we wiggle our way outside of what our actual convictions are, or we kind of create a rational argumentation as to why we can't fulfill the commandment, or why in this instance we can't really love, or we can't really forgive, or we can't move with compassion to this person because
Yeah, any number of reasons. But
any number of reasons.
like I've told people, when you look at the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, at the we never include this in the gospel, but Jesus says this is a parable about people who try to what is it? They try to defend themselves before God, but ultimately they're doing it for some other reason. I forget what the exact parable was, but when you look at it, basically the Pharisee is a paradigm of profound arrogance. And recently, when I was explaining this to a group of catechumens, I was looking on the internet. Well, it turns out there are different levels of arrogance. And it starts just from puffing myself up.
Right.
And then I puff myself up and I put a box around myself because I'm arrogant out of fear. I can't stand to have things that diminish my arrogance. And like I told people a lot of times, that's because somebody in my past told me that I had to be perfect and I can't tolerate not
Yep.
being perfect. It's
Yep.
fear. So I have to put myself in a box so I can be perfect within the box. And then the paradigm of arrogance is when people put themselves in the box and they start denigrating other people. In contemporary psychology, that is the paradigmatic form or the uppermost form of arrogance. We lock ourselves in a box and then we start denigrating other people. Why? Because we're afraid that we ourselves may not be as perfect as we think we be, or what's more likely, somebody in our past has told us we have to be, and it's certainly not God that has ever told us that, right? God
Right.
is utterly merciful and forgiving. Something else in our life is forcing us, and we probably don't even remember what it is, that we have to be perfect, and that's what's sitting on our shoulder, and it's making us terrified of not being perfect. And so anything that threatens us, we get rid of it and pretend it doesn't exist. We don't have to do it, because otherwise we would have to admit our own perfection, and then we would find ourselves degraded within ourselves by the person who insisted we had to be perfect.
Yep.
And sometimes, like I've told people, and sometimes I find people doing that, you have to look within your own past and see what within your own past. It could have been a parent, it could have been a teacher. I mean, I had some teachers that were like that. If you didn't do it perfectly, you could never succeed. And sometimes people inherit that within themselves, and they fall into those attitudes. And it's like we talk about forgiveness. It's what we do for ourselves for forgiveness. It's probably more important for ourselves than the people that we forgive, because by forgiving other people, we have to accept our own repentance and humility, right? We have to get over the arrogance that makes us stand over other people. So, yeah, in many sense, we are ourselves the adversary that we have to deal with and learn not to be our adversary, because Christ doesn't want us to be our adversary, right?
Right. Right. As we're moving further into Lent, with coming on the midpoint of this Sunday with the feast of the Veneration of the Cross, are there any particular? I especially like to reference in my own teaching and preaching the hymns of the church, because the hymns are given to us
Yeah.
uh, in such a way to help form in us these virtues that we're talking about, or this Christ-likeness. Uh, are there any particular hymns? I know in the before Lent, I'm acutely aware, and even our readings, will remind us
Mm-hmm.
about the core of fasting and what we're doing as we're approaching fasting. That we're not, that food is ultimately nothing as much as what comes out of us rather than what is put into us. Is there themes at all that have jumped out at you? Because I know you do an incredible job for those who want to get this book of delving into the scriptures and into the tradition, not just quotes from the fathers, but examples of our hymnody, especially. Are there particular hymns that have jumped out at you that you'd like to share with us, or?
Well, this is if you look on, where's the page number? Wait, Adobe doesn't allow you to scroll unless you ask it to allow you to scroll. There we go. If you look on page 169, you'll see I did a lot of selected hymns for our response to Christ's compassion. If you look at beginning with 200, okay, these are three hymns from the Sunday of St. Mary of Egypt, coming up in 2 Sundays, 3 Sundays if we count this one. And we often think of St. Mary of Egypt as a woman, and sadly we tend to view her as simply, well, she was overly lustful and she gave off. But I'm going to be very honest with you. I've read a lot of things in contemporary psychology. A young lady who's 12 years old was probably abused. The tendency, just don't pass it off on lust. She was probably abused. And sadly, with people who are abused like that, they do what they need, they do how they were abused to affirm themselves as human beings,
Right,
right?
survival. Yeah.
To survive. And she ultimately leaves, the human atmosphere, the human civilization. She goes off. And sometimes we can present, see, it's an inward life. It's an inward life of fasting and prayer and penitence, and the outward life doesn't matter. But these are three hymns from the fifth week of Great Lent, and they're on page 169. With their tongues the dogs licked the sores of Lazarus the beggar, showing towards him a greater compassion to the poor man than the rich did. Rich and lacking compassion, my mind has despised and cast out faith in your commandments before the gate, O lover of mankind. But as sympathetic and a lover of compassion, raise it up once again in compassion as you raised your friend Lazarus, who was 4 days dead. Number one, we have all learned the meaning of this parable, O Lord. Let us then hate the rich man's lack of compassion, asplagnos, that we may escape punish and rejoice forever with Abraham. And 82. So if you go through those hymns, I'm not going to read them all, but there's about 20, 15, how many, 77 to 87. There's 10 hymns from the Triodian, and many of them are for Lent, right? Yoking love with compassion, O you faithful, let us make haste to offer our prayer to Christ, that he may raise us from the grounds of our secret compassion. Yoking, well, how does he do that? We yoke love with compassion, right? Have mercy on me, O God, have mercy on me. This is from one of the things for repentance. Why do you wrong the poor man? Why do you withhold the worker's pay? Why do you not love your brother and sister? Why do you pursue lust and pride? Therefore, abandon all these things and repent for the sake of God, which means, let me have mercy on others as God has mercy on us. We don't often hear those hymns in the liturgy. In the other services, and many of us don't do those, and I mean, I do a part of my life where I don't do them, but if you can read them, they are profound within the Lenten Triodian. They really define it, just as the initial Gospels do from the early part, where it's where God appears to the people in the Old Testament. He says, "I'm interested in your being using this or giving money. Fast from things. Take care of the poor. Calm people." That's one of the very first Old Testament readings as we begin the Triodian. That
Yes.
theme of caring for others is integral to Lent, which is why I suggested we talk about Lent, fasting, and almsgiving. If we look at the ultimate meaning of the root meaning of that term, eleemosine, it's mercifulness. It's Lent, fasting, and mercifulness, and those elements of the Triodian stress that is a fundamental feature that we are to do. Why? Because it helps us become like Christ.
Yeah. What part of the book you are articulating a difference between the rational and the affective, and that compassion is something that is not just mental gymnastics, but it is something that requires your heart. And I think it's at the core of what we are going through in this Lenten season is that we are seeking Christ so that in our encounter with Christ, or as Saint Maria of Paris, when she talks about others as icons of Jesus, that they are
Mm-hmm.
like little mini theophanies of God Himself to us. If we were to actually encounter Christ and be transformed by Him, one of the basic avenues that is given to us is exactly as in the encounter with others.
Okay.
What what were you trying to articulate in this idea of the rational and the affective?
Well, let me back up a little bit. I studied for many years to be a classical pianist, and unfortunately, I couldn't get my fingers to move properly. But when I studied for a long time from a professional classical pianist, and she always used to tell me, "John, you got to play more musically." And what I understood was, when you play really technically, it's a head trip. But
Right.
when you play musically, she didn't mean play with more feeling. And what I began to learn, especially when I got into philosophy and started studying Heidegger and some of the existentialists, there's an intelligibility to things over and above reason. And if you're a musician, you know that. So a lot of times when I'm talking with some of our parishioners about doing that, about how we get into this thing of getting out of our head and stuff like that, and sometimes they don't know how to do it, and I'll ask people, "Did you ever play a musical instrument? Did you? What instrument?"
I, I played violin when I was a kid.
Okay. And when you played violin, did you play it from your head?
Uh, or if I did, I couldn't play. It's something that I had to tradition. I'll use my adult language of way of speaking. I had to tradition my entire self into the music.
Thank you. Okay. When you play music, And I've seen the same thing with people who are athletes, right?
Yes.
I'll ask them, where did you play the music from? Or where did you let the music play you from? And they say, I played it from here. It's
Yep.
the same thing. When you play the violin, you play it from here because it's your whole being that's doing it.
Yep.
And when you play music, there's a meaning and intelligibility to it. And when I was in the philosophy department and still played the piano, I'd walk around with some of my colleagues who did aesthetics, and I talk about it, and they tell me, "Oh no, no, the meaning of music is in people thinking about the music." And I thought, you never played a piano because there's a famous story. There's a
You
famous
only thought
story.
about playing one.
There's a famous story of Beethoven, who wrote very, very complex piano sonatas towards the end of his life. And he was at a gathering where people were in his house, and he played, I think it was like the 22nd piano sonata. And one of the people sitting there said, "Beethoven, can you please tell me what this means?" And he turned back and he played the piano sonata again, which means if you want to learn what it means, my friend, you have to let the music play you, and to let the music play you, you have to play it from here. And if you
Yep.
don't play an instrument, folks, if you're listening to this, if you go to the opera or you go to a concert, when you really listen to the music and it becomes musical for you, it's not a head trip. It's an experience of your whole person centered in what the Jewish tradition called and what we call the heart, right? Because the heart is that part of us that unites the body, soul, mind, and spirit. That's its fundamental role in our tradition, right? So if we think now of being compassionate, see, I learned this ultimately when I became Orthodox. I had a hard time praying when I was, because I was so open to doing philosophy. But when I
Right.
finally entered the Orthodox tradition and fell in love with the chanting, because I love to do the chanting and everything, and suddenly learned, and this was something actually the Dionysius, the Areopagus, talked about the hymns, the words and everything are given to you by God to lead you beyond them into the silence. And I suddenly realized that, when I'm doing the liturgy, partly as a communicant, but when I was a priest, the whole liturgy, the things that we play, the things that we say, all of the icons, they're really given to us to experience a meaning that we got to get out of our heads, as one of the fathers says, and into our hearts. Sorry, I can't remember the name. And the reason we've got to get out of our head and into our hearts is not to knock our heads and tell us to be irrational, but
Right.
tell us if we want knowledge as gnosis, as experience, we have to center ourselves here to open ourselves to the presence of the person of Christ. And the whole liturgy gets us to do it. That it centers us, which is why in our community I love congregational singing, because the more people join with the congregational singing, and I'll ask them, when you sing, do you sing from here? And a lot of people, they sing from here. And I say, see, that helps you get out of your head and into your heart, because that's the center of who you are. And where are we compassionate from? We're compassionate from our heart, right? But that
Yes.
doesn't mean it's an emotion composed to reason. Rather, there's an intelligibility to those experiences. And like I'll always tell people, when you have a personal experience with somebody, whether it's love or somebody else, do you sit there and talk philosophy to them? No. Do you sit there and think up here? No. When you have a really intense relationship with someone, ultimately you're silent in that relationship, and you have the relationship from here because it's experience from one another, and it's the experience of your whole person. It's your body, it's your mind, it's your feelings. Some people just write off the feelings as emotions. I'm sorry, it's through our feelings that I understand how somebody feels. It's some of
Yep.
the things I think you follow in some of Star Trek. If I'm a robot, I don't have a clue how somebody else feels because I was never engineered to have feelings. We were engineered to have feelings so that we could learn how other people feel, right? But we
Yep.
do that from here. There's an intelligibility to it that up here the head loses. Which why I've often told people, if you really want to learn the meaning of compassion about not stigmatizing other people, you have to get out of your head and into your heart, because you can think about philosophy all day long, or you can do all of the classes in the university you want about who you are as a human being and completely miss that part of you which may be stigmatizing somebody that you fear because it's down here and you just write it off as feelings.
Yep.
But then, I use certain terms in classes. I will use it here, but there's the N word, which is a denigrating term. And I tell my students, or use certain terms with women that are denigrating, a word that starts with B, and words that we use to describe any number. When we were in the Vietnamese War, they were used, I forget what the term
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
And I said, when you hear those words, is the meaning of the terms just a rational term in your head, or is there a denigrating meaning in those terms? And they'd say, yeah, there's a denigrating meaning, which is why white people at least don't use the N word. It's
Right.
used in black people as a cultural thing. We don't use it because you can't separate that denigrating meaning out of that word. It's embedded into it. And when you say that term, you don't say it like you say the term Homo sapien from up here. When people say that term, or when they use the other terms where they're denigrating other people, those terms come out of here, right? And you can hear it because of the way they say it, right? If you teach it in a philosophy class and you're just using it, but even then, that meaning, that effective meaning comes into it. So there's meaning that comes into things. It's not reducible to concepts, right? And I think that's part of why our faith discloses a meaning to things that's rooted in our heart, where body, mind, soul, emotions, they all get united together. So the head-heart thing in our tradition is way different from what you find in many of the Western traditions. It's where we're united as persons, and where is it that we open ourselves to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? He dwells in our heart. You get that in one of the prayers of Chrysostom. But if the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit dwell in our heart, and we open ourselves to that, what do they help us do? To battle the battle we have between the good passions and the bad passions within us, so that we can be united with Christ and have control over those. It doesn't throw out our mind as just ideas. It's not a fundamentalist kind of thing, I'm sorry. It rather, we use our whole rationality so that when we go back and think about our human beings, we don't fall into the conceptual things that lead us to denigrate others. And I'll give an example of the 19th century Immanuel Kant. I don't know if you ever studied him in a philosophy class. This grand thing about everything was reason and everything, and the mind was the role of everything. Well, it turns out that Kant was interconnected at times with a number of civilizations, especially in Southeast Asia. When you look at his writings, he was a racist. He denigrated a lot of people in those Southeast countries as well as African people. And you look back at it and you suddenly realize here's somebody who's so caught up with his head, which he sees as the Western model of being human, that if you don't share in that Western model of human being, you're inferior as a human being. So you find this racism in him. You find it in some other 19th century thinkers who are these supreme rationalists. But because of that, they can't be aware of the denigration that they're doing within themselves. That's the problem of selling yourself just to your mind.
Yeah.
Okay?
If you have Kant as one version of that, you can find all sorts of other versions in different areas, right?
Yeah.
Not just in philosophy, which you're of course speaking from a philosophical standpoint. Well, Father, we've talked for about an hour, so I very much appreciate your time and the insight and the book. Again, it's Moved by Compassion, Exploring the Core of Orthodox Christian Life. It's from St. Vladimir Seminary Press. I feel convicted and moved by what you've written, and
Thank you.
especially getting down into, and I'm not, I really encourage people to pick it up. Even if I think you can move through and look at different chapters and dive in because you've done an incredible job of resourcing and giving, especially for priests, I think, some content to be able to reflect on and their preaching and the teaching about compassion in the Lenten season. Is there anything that you would like to drive home as we come to a close?
Just one final thought as we move through the remainder of Lent. We approach Palm Sunday and then the week in which Christ approaches the cross and suffers in death. Of all the icons, keep the icon of the Good Samaritan before you. And remember that Christ's entire journey is a journey of the Good Samaritan. And as he does all of that, he's bearing us on our backs. He bears us on our backs in the cross. He bears us on our backs when he descends into Hades and bestows life on those who were, who are those who are dead. And as I tell people, he still bestows it on us in the Eucharist, because when we come forward and we receive the body and blood of Christ, he's still carrying us on our shoulders, right? He's still the Good Samaritan to us, along with the Father and the Holy Spirit. So I would think if you can think of the profound meaning that that parable is a parable that Jesus is telling about himself as the Samaritan whom the Jewish person would have denigrated and whom the Samaritan normally would have denigrated. If you see the Good Samaritan as somebody who welcomes everybody as his neighbor, which is the meaning of the parable, if you keep that in mind, that I think can help you get through Good Lent, because who you want to become is the icon of Christ as a Good Samaritan, because that's who he is. That's who he tells us he is.
Thank you, Father. Very moving. And I pray that we all continue our Lenten journey and opening our hearts to the convictions and enlightenment that God has for us, and that we are transformed and encountering Christ in others, and being receiving that call to move with compassion towards others, that we ourselves answer that call and accept the vulnerability and the sacrifice, the cross that it is to be compassionate. Because as we know and as we sing, joy has come into the world through the cross, and that's how we will be resurrected and live the life that God has for us. So thank you, Father. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, and I wish you a very blessed Lent, and also to all of those who may listen to this. Take care. Bye bye.
You too. Bye.